Life Sciences to another installment on human impact and the environment. Today we're looking at what we do in terms of the diversity of our country and the loss to that, as well as solid waste disposal. It's important for us to understand the context of where we are. In the previous lessons, we've looked at human impact on the environment, we've looked at climate change, we've looked at water availability. We also spent some time looking at in terms of what happens with food security in a country. Today we're going to focus on protecting our biodiversity and understanding what it means to losing that, and also the impact of solid waste disposal in our environment. So let's get straight into the concepts and then let's try and understand what this means. So, have you ever thought about what makes a species disappear? And will humans drown in their own waste? So we often hear the context of species becoming endangered. We've heard of, sadly, the extinction of species gradually over time. Have we ever wondered what this would mean in terms of when species start to disappear? Certainly, this has a knock-on effect on the diversity of our environment. So let's try and understand what diversity means and what happens when we see species disappearing or their numbers radically decreasing over a short period of time. So, an overview in this lesson is that we will focus on both the loss of biodiversity as well as solid waste disposal. Let's try and unpack the concepts in this lesson. So, firstly, we're going to spend some time looking at what is biodiversity. We need to discuss why it's important to us to maintain biodiversity. It's important for us to gather what are the threats that currently our diversity faces. We're going to spend some time looking at habitat destruction, the impact of poaching on certain species of organisms, as well as alien plant invasion in terms of how those affect the diversity of living organisms. As an introduction, we've got to always look at a multiple choice question. So here we go. In what way are humans most impacting on the biodiversity of an ecosystem around the world? The options are: we are putting too many organisms in zoos or keeping them as pets. B, we are increasing biodiversity by breeding new species. C, we are destroying the habitats of a large number of species. Or D, recreational hunting. So all of these seem to be quite correct, but there is a significantly correct answer in this. And I think it's important for you to tune into the lesson. Let's try and understand what the impact is on biodiversity and then use that to understand and unpack this question at the end. Right, so some key words and concepts that we would look at. So it's important for us to understand what is biodiversity, and we'll unpack that concept. We know that we've been introduced to the term biome in grade 10, and we've looked at the different biomes in South Africa. We also mentioned the words indigenous, which we will use during this lesson, so plants that are naturally found in a country. We also will discuss the impact of exotic plants on the diversity, and most importantly, what the impact of alien invasive plants is on our biodiversity and on the indigenous plants in a biome. We also need to spend some time looking at poaching and the impact that poaching has on species in the context of biodiversity in South Africa. We've discussed monoculture previously, but we've got to look at how monoculture reduces biodiversity, the impact on deforestation, as well as the sustainable use of our resources in terms of protecting our biodiversity. So let's try and understand what is biodiversity and unpack that concept. So biodiversity refers to the variety of plant and animals species on Earth. So in the context of South Africa, we know that we live in a very diverse country from a cultural perspective, but also from a living natural organisms. So if we look at plant diversity and if we look at animal diversity, we are a country that is rich in this diversity. And hence, we've got to look at what is the impact of losing these species, not just on the one species, but in terms of what is the impact it has on the variety of other species that co-inhabit or depend on these species. Okay, so biodiversity ensures that we have food, fresh water, medicines, and fuel that we obtain from our environment. It also ensures that the climate is regulated, floods are controlled through our wetlands, diseases are kept in check by predators that eat the sick animals, as well as water is purified by our wetlands. So if we assume that the biodiversity is just important from an eco-tourism, we're wrong. If we assume that biodiversity is just for protecting our animals, then we're wrong. Biodiversity is crucial, not just to animals, not just to our tourism industry, but it's essential to our livelihoods, as we see that it affects not just the livelihoods of animals, but it also talks about the sustaining of our wetlands, which are important aquipurifiers of the water that we consume. So let's try and understand the context of how biodiversity affects us all. So the biodiversity ensures that seeds are dispersed, nutrients are recycled, so nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, and your oxygen and soil how they return back into the soil. It also helps us to improve the quality of our life by providing us with forms of recreation and ecotourism. And so that's an essential part of the country's financial incentives for us to attract tourists from other countries. And lots of them come to actually splendor in the diversity of living organisms as well as plants that we have. So from an economical perspective, our biodiversity is very important to us as a country. So we've looked at what is biodiversity. Let's look at the importance of maintaining this biodiversity. Okay, so if we think about why is it important, we have water quality that is cleansed, or we have our water wetlands that actually plays an important role in the quality of our water. So that's very important. We have air quality that is maintained. We have water quality that is maintained. Pest control. So if we think about why we have snakes are present, those snakes are important in controlling the pest. Birds that are predators or raptors that actually consume pests that are in the fields. So those also play an important role. We will look at what happens when we poison our carnivores because they are consuming some of our pests, and the impact that has on biodiversity. Pollination and crop production. So if we're using pesticides and they are all insecticides and how they affect our bees and insects, that in turn affects pollination. What happens with the prevention of natural disasters? We've got to look at climate stabilization and the provision of food security. Okay, so further on, let's look at the impact of threats to the biodiversity. So what is it that threatens our biodiversity? So farming methods that include monoculture. So farmers are planting a specific crop year after year. What does that do to the soil? The impact that that has on the biodiversity. So if we're clearing up land to ensure that we cultivate crop, what happens to the other species that are living in that diverse land? Are they able to sustain their needs by planting one type of crop? Yes, from a human consumption, but how do we protect the diversity of animals that live in these monocultured land spaces? Okay, overgrazing as a mechanism that destroys the fertility of a soil. And so overgrazing means that now we have animals that graze and reduce the plants that grow in an area, and thereby we reduce the diversity of plants in a specific area. So overgrazing has a huge impact on our biodiversity. The development of graph estates. So how we've created these estates that have been developed in natural areas that we call eco-estates now. However, a lot has been done in terms of these estate developments where they're now trying to protect and preserve and conserve the natural aesthetics of these environments. All that is done to ensure that the biodiversity of these areas are protected. We also know that mining has had a significant impact and threatened the diversity of living organisms. One, because mining is going to disrupt the natural ecosystem. There's lots of pollutants that are given off from mines that affects the diversity of organisms living in and around. We have acid mine runoffs that again pour into these rivers that destroy or affect the animals or the plant life that live in the water and along the water. So these are significant in terms of threats to our biodiversity. Urbanization and how the development of our cities have impacted on the diversity of animals living in and around. So as cities grow and how they start to grow and start encroaching on land outside cities, we find that urbanization also threatens our diversity. Deforestation, the removal of trees to build land for housing as well as to grow more crop, means that we're losing forest, and this in turn means that we're disrupting the natural habitat of these animals. And so where do the birds now go off to? Where do the animals that live in these areas move to? So again, affecting the diversity. The loss of wetlands and grasslands. As I discussed early on, wetlands are important aspects of our environment that serve as sponges that absorb the rain that we have. So this ensures that the water returns to the water table and that plants living in and around these areas are able to extract this water when needed. Okay? Poaching has been a significant factor that has led to species being threatened, from the rhinos to elephants. We know that poaching has been significant in affecting our diversity. We also know that there's been, over the years, alien plants that have encroached on our natural biodiversity, and these alien plants tend to use up the resources more effectively than our local indigenous plants. Again, a significant factor that affects the diversity of our natural indigenous plants in South Africa. Okay, so we've looked at alien plant invasion. We also need to look at this from an economical perspective. So alien invasive species may be controlled by mechanical, chemical, and biological control methods, and these are quite expensive and economically not viable. So this affects, again, the cost of maintaining our biodiversity. There are many mechanical methods that involve chopping down plants or the physical removal of them by hand, and this is very time consuming as well as it's a costly process. So the impact that these alien invasive plants have are significant, and it's costly to maintain that, and hence we've got to look at the effect that this has on our ecosystem. We also know that there are chemical control mechanisms where we spray herbicides onto these plants, and this will also impact on polluting the environment and can be very expensive. There are several biological methods, and these methods introducing their natural enemy in the form of alien plants that will then compete with these. Also, we have certain biological methods of removing alien invasive animals, where we introduce a natural predator into an area. And so as we get into the next session, we will look at waste disposal. So you guys need to get a break from my side, short break, and I'll see you back. Welcome back, life science learners. So in the previous segment, we've looked at what it means in terms of the loss of biodiversity. In this segment, we're going to look at the second topic, which is solid waste and disposal, and the impact that has on the environment. So let's get straight into this. So in solid waste, we've got to look at what is solid waste. We've got to look at what are the different types of solid waste, and we've got to look at how solid waste is classified. We do know that there's some important words that we need to unpack, and we'll do that as we get through the lesson. So what is solid waste? What is the difference between biodegradable and non-biodegradable? And we also need to unpack what is hazardous waste. You will see that in this lesson, we start off focusing on what is solid waste. Let's try and understand what is solid waste. So in this image, you often see these landfills that have heaps of waste that are being filled into land spaces. So that is a solid waste disposal facility. Have you ever thought about what goes into that space? So let's try and understand, what do we mean by solid waste disposal? So what is waste? Waste is also known as rubbish, trash, refuse, garbage, junk, litter, and these are basically unwanted or useless material. So often we find that we tend to waste substances, or the things that you discard for the municipality to take away, that's waste. Waste from buildings, waste from the consumption of food are all regarded as solid waste. In life sciences, waste is any of the many unwanted substances or toxins that are expelled from living organisms from metabolic waste such as urea and sweat. So we know that from a biological perspective, we also produce a lot of waste, and that waste can be carbon dioxide, it can be heat, it can be urea as well as sweat. And so that is a waste product that the body produces because of metabolism. Now, let's try and understand what are the different types of waste that we get and how we classify these. So there are 5 different types of waste if we were broadly speaking about them. You have organic waste, and so organic waste refers to your fresh produce, the peels and the vegetables that you consume and the leftovers of that. We also have hazardous waste, and these hazardous wastes are dangerous and they can cause harm and infection or damage to the environment. We also have solid waste that needs to be disposed of in a sustainable manner. We also have hazardous chemicals that are released from mines and industries that also can be regarded as waste. And then we have recyclable waste, that is things that can be reused or repurposed. And so we're going to look at how other methods of classifying waste products can be used in terms of differentiating what solid waste is. So, solid waste, waste in solid forms, domestic, commercial, and industrial waste are examples of solid waste. So plastic is an example of solid waste. Styrofoam from packaging, bottles, cans, papers, scrap iron, and other trash are all seen as examples of solid waste. So these examples are things that are significantly large, that take up a lot of space, and hence need to be cautious about how we dispose these. So when we look at liquid waste, these are waste in the form of the state of matter which is liquid. So your domestic washing, so from your baths and your toilets, that's domestic washing. Chemicals from industries, oils from industries, wastewater from sewage and from ponds. Manufacturing industries and other sources produce lots of waste in the liquid form. We also have waste in a gaseous state. And so waste is produced in the form of gases from refineries, so methane, carbon dioxide from your fossil fuel production, as well as sulfur dioxide. These are examples of waste that are in a gaseous state. Okay, so that was classification based on state of their matter. Let's look at how waste can be classified according to the origin and type. So we know that we have municipal solid waste, we have waste produced from hospitals, which we refer to as your biomedical waste. We also have industrial waste that's produced from industries that are responsible for the production of commercial goods. We have agricultural waste that is produced by farmers, and these include some of your waste that is not consumed by farmers, so by consumers. So we're talking about the leftover after crops have been taken away. So that's agricultural waste. We also have wastage from fisheries, and these would be parts that are not consumed, so the fins and the internal organs that are disposed of. We also have radioactive waste that are produced from your nuclear power plants. We also have electronic waste, and we're seeing more of this in terms of our computers, our electronic devices, and how these all contribute to waste disposal. Okay. We can also classify waste according to their properties. So by that I mean, are they biodegradable or non-biodegradable? And essentially the terms biodegradable refer to whether these organisms can degrade naturally in the environment. So can these be degraded? Example, paper, wood, fruits, and other items that will naturally decompose in the environment. we refer to them as biodegradable, in the sense that if you place these into the soil, they will undergo a gradual process of degradation and be broken up by the microorganisms, by the bacteria, and by some of the invertebrates that live in the soil. We also know that some of the waste that we release into the environment is non-biodegradable. So these cannot be degraded. And examples of that would be plastic, bottles, old machines, so which are made up of metal, cans, styrofoam containers, and others. And we refer to these as non-biodegradable. Some of these takes a few hundred to 1,000 years to actually be broken up naturally into the environment. So we refer to these as non-biodegradable waste. Okay, so here's an image that shows you the differentiation between your degradable and your biodegradable waste. And as you see, I mentioned the examples of your plant material, and these all can be returned into the soil. Human hair will degrade, as well as papers are examples of things that can be shredded and put into the environment and mixed with soil, and gradually they will degrade. However, we also have your non-biodegradable materials, and a classical example of that is your plastic bags that are used, as well as your electronic equipment, so your computers, your PCs, your cell phones. These are your TVs, are all electronic goods that are hardware that will not generally degrade or decompose in the environment. Plastic bottles, glass bottles are examples of your non-biodegradable materials that end up into landfills that pollute the environment if not disposed of effectively. So let's look at the classification of waste also based on the effects that it has on human health. So we also have waste that is hazardous. Hazardous would be waste that can cause harm to humans. So substances that are unsafe to use commercially, industrially, agriculturally, or economically have any of the following properties. So these would include, they are able to be ignited, they are corrosive, or they are reactive or toxic. So these would be things that could cause harm both to humans if they're disposed of, or to the animals and plants. So we refer to these as hazardous waste. So they are dangerous to the environment, but they're also dangerous in terms of people living around them. So we will see that certain industries produce corrosive substances that are given off into the environment, into water bodies, that are damaging to the water bodies, but also can contaminate these water bodies which humans rely on. So that is hazardous. We also know that there are certain non-hazardous wastes that are produced, and these substances are safe to use commercially, industrially, agriculturally, or economically, and do not have any of those properties mentioned early on when we discussed the hazardous waste. These generally can be disposed of without having significant impact on the environment. So steam, although is hot, but it can be released into your cooling towers that gradually release into the atmosphere, which does not have a hazard in terms of the people or the organisms living in that area. Okay, so we've looked at types of waste, we've looked at the different classifications of solid waste, and we've looked at the impact that it has on the environment. Guys, I think it's time we look at some questions and see how the adaptation of our understanding of solid waste can be applied in the context of a question. So this question is adapted from a paper that was written in 2013. It's got a table, and let's look at this table. So the table below shows the different types of waste and the decomposition times, so the time it takes to be broken down. And this is significantly alarming when we look at it in terms of the way we dispose of these waste products. So the types of waste: glass, aluminium, paper, orange peels, nylon fabric, and tin cans. And if you look at them, you will see that glass takes approximately 1 million years to be decomposed. Aluminium cans take between 80 to 200 years to decompose. Paper waste could take between 2 to 6 weeks, which is probably regarded as biodegradable. An orange peel can take up to 6 months to decompose. Nylon fabric, which is what is used in the manufacture of certain synthetic fabrics, could take between 30 to 40 years. A tin can, alarmingly, takes about 50 years. So guys, it's important to note these, especially as we dispose of our waste. So let's explain the term recycling. And I think it's important for us to pause at this point and reflect on the messages that have been sent through during the course of your studies. And we often use the three R's: recycle, reduce, reuse. And again, the concept of recycling refers to the impact that disposing of these waste products would have on the environment. So if we can start recycling certain substances, we will reduce the impact that they have on the environment, because many of these take several hundreds to thousands of years to decompose and return back to their natural state. So let's understand what recycling is. So recycling is the process of converting waste materials into reusable objects, or we say repurposing them, to prevent wastage potentially of useful materials, thereby reducing the consumption of fresh raw materials, energy, as well as reducing air pollution, water pollution, and by decreasing the need for us to conventionally dispose of substances into our landfills. So waste recycling, or recycling, again talks about the way we reuse certain substances or we repurpose them. And that's because in the production of something, a lot of energy has gone in and there was production of waste products. So if we have to dispose of that and not recycle it, it means that we would have to produce more and in turn impact the environment further negatively. Right, so let's look at the next question. Name one type of waste in the table below that can be recycled. So when we look at this table, let's look at one type of waste that can be recycled. So if we think about all of the glass, the aluminium, and the paper waste, a lot of this can be recycled. So recycling again means changing the purpose of this so that we can reuse them, thereby preventing them from being filled up into land space. So paper definitely can be recycled, glass can be recycled, aluminium and tin cans can be recycled and reused for their purposes, which are again going to reduce the impact that they have on solid waste landfills. Explain two advantages of recycling. So guys, it's important for us to understand that recycling means that we're reducing on the cost of production and we're reducing the impact that that has on the environment. So we reduce the energy that is required. We're reducing the consumption of raw materials that is required to produce raw products. We're reducing air pollution because it is a product that happens when substances are produced. We're also reducing water pollution. We're reducing what happens in landfills where waste products are deposited. Okay, so reducing the need for conventional waste disposal, as well as reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, are all significant aspects of recycling. And so recycling substances has a huge impact on not just on the prevention of landfills, but also in the terms of the production of substances and the waste products that are produced during the production line. So guys, we've looked at waste disposal. We've tried to apply some of our understanding in the context of how decomposition takes very long for some substances or certain products, and how it's important for us to recycle some of these so that we reduce the impact that goes into the reproduction of more of these substances that we dispose of when we need them. So guys, you've done well. You've stuck into the session. I think you guys deserve a break. Let's have a short break, get some oxygen in those muscles, and we'll tune in for our last segment. Stay tuned after a short while. See you then. Welcome back, life science learners, to our final segment this day. We were looking at the impact that humans have on the environment by looking at loss of biodiversity. We spent some time looking at solid waste disposal. We've looked at the different types of solid waste, and we attempted to solve a question where we looked at how the impact of recycling can reduce the impact that solid waste has on the environment. In this segment, we want to recap on the loss of biodiversity, and we need to attempt to apply some of that in the context of a question. So let's recap on the loss of biodiversity, and let's apply some of our understanding to a question. So in this segment earlier on, we looked at what was biodiversity. We've looked at the importance of maintaining biodiversity. We discussed what the threats to biodiversity are. We spent some time looking at habitat destruction in terms of how that occurs. We looked at poaching as an impact on biodiversity, and we've discussed what alien plant invasion is and how that becomes quite expensive to maintain. In this segment, let's look at the impact of poaching by applying our understanding to the conservation of animals in South Africa. So the question reads, study the table showing a summary of the rhino poaching incidents in South Africa from 2006 to 2010. And guys, you would know that there's been a lot of poaching of rhinos that has happened in the last 20 years. And the government of South Africa, along with South African National Parks Association, has done significant conservation work in maintaining and protecting these precious animals that we have. However, because of such a lucrative industry that thrives on the trade of these animals and the products of these, we've seen a significant decrease of some of our major big five animals. So in terms of elephants, rhinos, and even lions have experienced significant poaching in the last 20 years. So let's look at these stats and let's try and understand the impact that poaching has had in South Africa in the context of rhinos. So here the table below shows you the different provinces, and it shows you the number of animals that have been poached over 2006 till 2010. So we've got the Kruger National Park, we're seeing numbers from Limpopo, Mpumalanga Northwest, the Eastern Cape, Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, Northern Cape, and these have been totaled as illegally hunted. So we do know that there's a process of culling that takes place, which is a natural process where certain conservation parks need to control the number of animals that are in that confined space. But we know that a lot of the animals that are killed have been illegally killed or poached, and that is done for the trade of certain parts of these animals. So this table shows you the comparative stats, and what is alarming is to look at the totals that have gradually increased since 2006. And we're seeing that there's been a steady increase in these numbers, and it's alarming to consider that, you know, we are possibly facing a possible threat to many of our indigenous animals because of poaching. So let's look at the first question. This question has been adapted from Mind the Gap chapter 11. I think it's a very crucial question in terms of understanding the application of poaching. So the first question refers to how many rhinos were illegally hunted in 2009. And if we go back to that table, if we look at in 2009, I think the question points to were illegally hunted in 2009. So in 2009, we can see that a total of 122 were illegally hunted. And so that is a question that requires that you read through a table and you extrapolate information from that. So in this case, there were 122, my apologies, that were illegally hunted in the year 2009. Suggest 3 ways in which the poaching of rhinos can be stopped. So guys, we know that education and awareness about rhino poaching is something that we've been discussing at school. However, there are active programs that have been taken by the conservation authorities in South Africa. And so these challenges have been met with, and we've had to embrace new laws, we've had to embrace new techniques to conserve and to be more proactive around preventing these animals from the mercy of poachers. So let's look at what has been done. So we do know that because of these alarming stats and the steady increase, the conservation authorities have had to act very fast and very effectively, despite the challenges that they face. So what must be done, or what has been done? So we know that there's been certain programs where the horns are sawn off, and this is essentially a controlled process of removing the horns of these rhinos when they are much younger. And the idea behind this is to prevent these rhinos from being poached upon. So yes, it is sad to see a rhino without a horn, but it is also a point where the rhino is protected and it can survive. Unfortunately, the horns are not significantly important to the rhino in terms of its livelihood. It can survive without a rhino horn, but it also means that it is being spared from being poached. However, we do know that some poachers are malicious, and because the horn has been removed, they sometimes tend to poison these rhinos in kind of disappointment that the rhino's horn has been removed. So we still do face the impact that this has, but it's significantly reduced the numbers. We also know that there have been pro tags that have been fitted into these rhinos as collars to monitor their movement. And so if we can monitor the rhino movement in their natural habitats, we're able to track where they are, we're able to monitor their numbers and their positions, so that should there be a movement of them or a lack of movement of these, they can be tracked down to a specific location and again either assisted or necessary steps taken to protect them. We also know that there are heavy penalties like imprisonment that have been instituted instead of fines. So we know that sometimes the monetary fines are significantly inconsequential to the impact that these have had on the rhinos. So we know that heavy fines have been in the past been issued to people that have been caught with these horns. However, the laws have been changed, and these include imprisonment, and which has significant consequences on reducing the number of rhinos being poached. However, there are new techniques that have been involved where the rhino horns have been DNA fingerprinted, or rhinos have been DNA fingerprinted. And this is essentially to be able to link a possible poacher to a site where a rhino has been poached. So in the past, when a poacher was caught with a horn, it was very difficult for us to understand which rhino that horn belonged to. And it's important that the law system is able to identify and link a horn and a poacher to a site where that has been poached from. And so that has provided significant assistance to the judiciary in terms of linking people or linking poachers to a site where a rhino has been poached. The next question: describe the general trend observed in the table. And if you look at the table, you can see that the general trend is that if we look at the total numbers in 2006, and if we compare that to in 2010, we can see that these numbers have significantly increased. So if we look at the total numbers, there have been a significant increase from 2006 to 2010. And this talks to what has happened in terms of the international trade of these horns, in terms of the demand for them. So we've seen that there's been an increase from the year 2008 to the year 2010. Okay, by what percentage did the poaching of rhino incidences increase in the Northwest from 2008 to 2010? So it's important that we identify in the question the province, and the question wants us to calculate the percentage. So let's look at the table, and we've got to look at the time period, which is 2008, for the province of Northwest. So when we look at the table, so we're looking at the Northwest province, and it's from 2008 to 2010, and so we've got to identify what is the increase of these numbers. So it increased from 7 all the way to 44. Let's calculate what this means as a percentage of increase. So if you plug in the numbers, you can see that it's 44 over 7 times 100, because we need to calculate that as percentage. And this shows that it has increased by 628 times. This is a significant increase in the number of rhinos. So it's a radical increase, almost 6 times, and hence that's a significant concern in that number. The next question: use the data in the table and draw a histogram to show the number of rhinos poached in each year from 2006 to 2010. So again, the question requires that we draw a histogram, and remember that we've got to apply all the rules that we need when drawing a graph. So if we just want to go back to the question, so we've got to find out the poached from, so it's the, draw a histogram to show the number of rhinos poached from each year. So we've got to know the total number from each year in that period. So if we go back to that graph, so we've got to go look at these values, and I'm going to keep my graph up here, and I've plotted the graph for you, but I want to show you the mark allocation for this. So it's important that we first give the graph a heading. So this is a histogram, and I'll remind you that a histogram is a bar graph with no spaces. So essentially it is a graph where the bars have no spaces. So if it was a bar graph, we will see that there would be clear spaces between them, but the question wants us to draw a histogram, so we would notice that the bars are connected between one to the next. Again, so we've illustrated that it's a histogram, and we've got to have both the dependent and the independent variable in this. So the dependent variable is the number of rhino horns that were poached, and this was in the time period from 2000 to 2010. So we clearly see that the heading has both the dependent and the independent variable in it. We had to also create a scale on the y-axis, and for me to do that, I had to look at what the lowest number was, and we can see that the lowest number is 24, and the highest number is, if we go to that, is 247. So we're looking at approximately 250. So our scale needs to be in a scale of 50s, and I've chosen units of 50. So I've gone from 0 all the way in values of 50 to 250, and I've labeled this as my dependent variable, and in this case it is the total number of rhino poaching incidences, which I've plotted on the y-axis. Our independent variable goes onto the x-axis, and in this case we have time, and that time is given in the unit of years, and that's important for us to identify that the unit is years and the variable is time. So guys, when plotting a bar graph, you've got to make sure that, a histogram, you've got to make sure that these bars are all equal in width, and we can see that they are clearly labeled, and in this case I've not used a key, but I have labeled the bars on the x-axis in terms of the time period. If you chose to indicate the labels as A, B, and C, then you would have to put in a key here where you would indicate that A is the time period, in this case the year 2006, and B would be 2007. So it's important that you clearly identify which bars represents, in this case, which year, and then you would have to plot these values out. And if we go to the first one, you can see that in the year 2006 we had 24 that were poached. So this would take us to a value of 24, and you would draw that bar out neatly using a ruler, and then you would plot the next one, and you would eventually plot this graph knowing that you've plotted all 5 time periods, and you would have labeled them accordingly. So guys, let's read the next question. The next question talks about the rooibos plant, and let's read through that question and answer some of the questions based on that. We know that the rooibos is an indigenous plant, and this plant is grown in South Africa. It grows in South Africa naturally, and it's been commercially used as a tea, but it also has a lot of medicinal properties. So let's look at the context of this. So the rooibos plant is used to make herbal tea. South Africa is the only commercial grower of rooibos plants in the world. There's a huge market for this. Rooibos tea is a caffeine-free beverage with health and medicinal benefits. Some of the benefits of drinking rooibos tea are that it has a calming effect, it helps with digestion, and it helps with infant colic. So you would have probably seen lots of varieties of rooibos tea. And so it's an indigenous herb, it's produced in the Cape Fynbos, and it grows naturally there, and it's a huge potential income for the South African tea industry. However, there's a demand internationally for it, and we see that this creates an opportunity for it to create exploitation. So let's look at the questions based on this. So the first question is, describe 2 ways in which over-exploitation of plants such as the rooibos impacts on other life forms in the environment. And as we discussed, we referred to biodiversity earlier on. And remember that every organism has a specific role and position that it occupies. The removal of these will impact on the food chain, and it will impact on the biodiversity. So if the rooibos plant is over-harvested, think of the impact that it would have on the insects that live on this, on the bees and on the birds that rely on the flowers of these plants. So let's try and understand what happens when we remove a species from its natural environment. Okay, so the rooibos plant, as we discussed, you'll find that these plants can become extinct, firstly because we overexploit them. It could lead to the loss of the biodiversity of that environment. Remember that each plant or organism plays a specific role in its food chain, in turn affecting food webs, which can be destroyed when a single organism is removed. Excuse me. It could lead to the degradation of the environment because this plant could have a specific role in its environment. Removal of these plants because of exploitation could also mean that there's nothing to hold the soil, and so we find that there's erosion on the surface, and if too many of these plants are removed, we could end up with a significant amount of plant topsoil being removed, and so that would mean there's increased runoff of water. It also could mean that other alien invasive plants can now inhabit these areas, which were previously inhabited by the fynbos. So we would unintentionally upset the balance, not only of the ecosystem, but as well as the oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this could, if we go further, lead to some sort of global warming if too many plants are removed. And we see that the impact of a single species has a significant impact on the environment, on the biome, and in the greater scheme, the entire globe. So guys, we've looked at human impact on the environment in the context of food security. We've looked at human impact on the environment in terms of the loss of biodiversity, and we've also discussed in this segment the impact that solid waste disposal has on the environment. So guys, let's be conscious about the environment. This is there for us for the future. We need to protect it. We need to be conscious about the decisions we make. So when we walk around, appreciate the environment that we have. Consider what happens when we leave litter. And so imagine what happens when the disposal of waste accumulates in the environment. So guys, conserve the environment we live in. Remember the 3 R's: recycle, reuse, and reduce. From my side, all the best. Stay safe, stay calm, and be wise.